time of unprecedented global turmoil, I've been speaking to the former U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who knows all too well about issues like Greece, the hay Putin's making, and spy games on the world stage. Secretary Albright, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Christiane.
So here we are in Berlin, and the de facto ruler of the EU, the leader of the EU, Chancellor Merkel, is trying to grapple with Greece. The American Deputy Secretary General of NATO has said that they're very worried that it could have bad repercussions if there's a Brexit, and not just economic repercussions. What do you think about that? Do you think it's worrying, the whole Greece issue?
I think it's very worrying because of the location of Greece, the role of Greece, the whole issue about how the European Union functions, the relationship of the European Union to NATO, and all the things that are going on in the neighboring countries and the neighborhood in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So I think that it's obviously a very complicated picture as far as Greece itself and its economic issues and its relationship to Northern Europe and all those parts. But from an American perspective, I think it is very worrisome.
Particularly as it's been pointed out that it was in 1947 that the Americans went overboard to keep Greece in Europe and not let it go into the Soviet sphere.
Absolutely. It's what President Truman worked on very hard. It was the beginning of a whole American foreign policy of assistance, of trying to figure out how to make sure that it didn't go communist and that it stayed part of Europe, and recognized the importance not only of Greece per se, but what its symbolism really was. And so I think it is very troubling.
Right now, Prime Minister Tsipras, seems to be reaching out quite a lot to President Putin and Russia. And President Putin is enjoying sort of playing this game, as he's done quite a lot over the last few years. Is there a worry that Russia could sort of embrace Greece, or Greece could go more into that orbit?
I think it's very hard to figure out what Putin is up to, except for one thing. I think what he wants to do is split the Western alliance. And I think that is part of his game. And I think it's unfortunate to see that the Greeks seem to be falling for it. But the bottom line is, if they need money, the Russians don't have money. So what is this all about? Why is it going on? Also, what makes me nervous is, I know this is what negotiations are like, but it seems very kind of high wire act at a time that is very important. NATO is meeting, and the European Union, the finance ministers, everybody's on this, but I do think that the Russians think that they can get an advantage out of it, and I hope that the Greeks don't give them that game.
The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has even suggested that NATO might bolster its nuclear deterrent in the region, because Putin has been talking a lot about bolstering their nuclear arms and talking a lot about the nuclear option. How do you read what he's doing? And all these years after, the fall of the wall and all the rest of it, this whole nuclear idea between Russia and NATO?
Well, partially, I think that Putin's whole attempt here is to deal with what I think is an identity crisis that the Russians are having. It's not easy to have been a superpower and all of a sudden not to be, and Putin has bought into this in so many ways to say that he is returning Russia to its grandeur. What he forgets, or has never known, is that Russia's future is in having a good relationship with Europe, not to just kind of be a threat. And whatever happens always whenever the nuclear equation comes into it is an example of that the conventional forces are not strong enough. That's been kind of the story throughout the Cold War. I think it's dangerous, but I do think that what we have to remember is what NATO is doing is practicing deterrence. NATO did not start this. Putin started it by doing something completely illegal since the end of the Second World War, of going into a country and seizing its territory. So I used to say this generally about the Saddam Hussein is, how did the war start? It started, as he said, when the other guy hit me back. So I think we have to be very careful, but to remember that what NATO is doing is deterrence.
You have said recently that the world's in a mess, that it is the most combustible that you remember in your lifetime or in recent decades. How bad is it?
Well, I know that, and we talked a little bit about Russia before, clearly during the Cold War it was dangerous. There were nuclear missiles facing each other, but in a weird way, there were kind of rules of the game. We were signed various treaties. There were rational actors involved in having discussions. There were meetings. What has happened now is there are more players in it. Then there are what we call non-state actors that are not part of the system. We don't exactly know how to deal with them. A lot of national institutions don't function very well. And the international structure, whether you're talking about the European Union or the United Nations, we are a little bit kind of surprised and out of control in terms of the forces that have been let loose. So I think we're in a very different era. We need to figure out how to have national and international governance. And I have stolen the statement from somebody, but it works so well about what's going on, given what's happening in technology, that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments hear them on 20th century technology and are providing 19th century responses. And so there is no confidence in the institutions that exist, whether the governments of countries deliver for their people, or whether the international system can come to some agreement in dealing with so many, a real variety of issues, whether they're social, economic, political, and environmental.
The French government has just called in the American ambassador in Paris to complain very loudly about WikiLeaks reports that this current French president and his two predecessors were regularly spied upon by the United States, including their personal cell phones. I mean, really? Does the U.S. really need to be doing that? And of course we had the whole scandal with Angela Merkel and her being spied upon.
I think that I have real trouble with this particular issue, because the truth of the matter is everybody is spying on everybody, and there is a great deal of hypocrisy around this. I think that there is a need to share information, especially as we talk about what the various threats are out there. But I find it passing strange that some of these countries get into such an uproar over things that they do themselves.
Even personal cell phones of the leaders? I mean, can you imagine President Obama's being spied upon? Was President Clinton spied upon?
I have no idea, but I think that the bottom line is that it is. I think that people do things that you wish they didn't. I think that, but I do think that everybody spies on everybody, and the bottom line is trying to figure out what the level is and why, and whether. One of the hardest parts I find at the moment, Christiane, is that people say, and there's such ambiguity in everything. People put out incredible amount of information about themselves, and then they're concerned when people know something about them. Or if some horrible event happens, such as a terrorist attack, and then they say, why didn't your government know about this? So I think we are very unclear about privacy, secrecy, capability, who does what to whom, and I think we need to develop some new rules, but I do think there is a great deal of hypocrisy going on.
Didn't you discover you were spied upon when you were Secretary of State?
What they found was that a room on the 7th floor of the State Department near the office of the Secretary of State was being bugged by Russians. There was a Russian man sitting outside actually listening to us.
Sitting outside where?
Outside the State Department somewhere. They found him. Then we did what you normally do when you find something like you do a démarche and tell Moscow you shouldn't do this. But I think you know that I have my PIN diplomacy. So the next time I met with the Russians, I wore a very large bug pin, and they knew exactly what I was saying.
And did it stop?
Presumably.
Secretary Albright, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much.